Good day, everyone. This is Nancy Ozawa. I'm Head of Marketing here at Javelin, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar titled Skyrocketing CNP Fraud, Jeopardizes Top of Wallet Status. I would like to also thank Gemalto for making this webinar possible for all of us to be able to enjoy. For those of you who are familiar with Gemalto or maybe not, Gemalto is the world leader in digital security, enabling banks, enterprises, and organizations around the world to offer trusted digital services to billions of people. So thank you to Gemalto for making this webinar complimentary and available to everybody today. What I'd like to do is to first go through a few housekeeping items to make sure that you are going to be able to make the most of today's webinar, and then I will go and introduce our speakers and we'll get started. So first up on housekeeping items, this webinar is slated for 60 minutes. So we will be stopping at the top of the hour. We do encourage questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible and answer your questions. What we'll be doing is having both of the speakers present the content, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. If you'd like to ask a question, if you look to the right-hand side of your screen, there is a box titled Questions. Feel free to enter those questions in at any point, and you'll get into the queue. If you've got any questions or IT issues as well, feel free to enter them there and I will help address them with you. So make sure you do ask as many questions as you'd like. We'd love to hear from you. And then the other question I'm always asked, so let me answer it now. We are recording this webinar. I always get requests for people to want to watch the webinar again or share it with coworkers. So we are recording the webinar. It will be available to you tomorrow. You will get an email from us with a link to the webinar recording, thanks to Gemalto, and you can watch it again. And Gemalto has also offered to have the slide deck available. So at the end of the presentation, you'll see an email address. If you email that address and request a copy, we'll make sure that it gets routed to somebody to get that delivered right over to you. So without further ado on housekeeping items, I want to get started on introducing our speakers so you can get into the interesting content today. Our first up speaker is Al Pasquale, who is the head of fraud and security here at Javelin. Al has got extensive background in both the fraud practices, leading fraud investigations, so he'll be very apropos for this webinar. He monitors industry trends, including biometrics and banking and payments, the effects of data breach, the relationship of identity fraud and loyalty, and how to best secure payment data and transactions. Our other speaker is Håkan Nordvall, who is a Senior VP of e-banking and e-commerce at Gemalto. Håkan leads global strategy and product development for the company's digital banking solution. He's got extensive experience in both the telecom and banking sectors and has been instrumental in leading deals with major operators and blue chip companies. So we've got two excellent speakers that have a lot to share with us today. Let me hand this over to Al Pasquale to get us started and share the agenda and get started on the webinar. Al?
Thanks, Nancy. So we're going to start by taking a look at the card-not-present fraud issue. And that's going to include a little bit of background data, including what we've come to expect post-EMV. From there, we're going to jump into some very particular challenges that don't think get enough coverage right now. Things you got to consider when you're thinking about solutions to implement. From there, we're actually going to dive into some particular solutions and then finally crystallize everything with some key takeaways. So what does card-not-present fraud look like? All right, what are some of the strategies we can implement to manage the risk, and maybe what are some of the strategies, or what are some of the strategies that have been implemented elsewhere, and what can we learn from that? Before we jump into some of the early data, we're going to get a quick polling question out there just to understand a bit more about the audience and what their priorities are. And what we want to understand is, when are you planning to roll out a new card-not-present fraud solution or security solution? We have some options here. Now, obviously, for some folks, it's not going to necessarily apply. But given the perception of the outsized risk around card-not-present, now I'm not going to give anything away as far as the data is concerned, but given maybe your perception of the risk of card-not-present within your organization, how are your plans being impacted to roll out new solutions, just so we can get a sense, of where you are right now. And with that, we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, it looks like about 3/4 say within the year. That is actually very encouraging. As a fraud practitioner myself, I am definitely a huge proponent of getting ahead of the problem, and a little bit surprising, but still very encouraging. All right. So let's dive into the data. So when we talk about card-not-present fraud, there was a lot of concern about EMV being released in the United States. That concern was very much based on what we had seen in other markets, places like Europe, Canada, Australia. And while EMV is an incredibly effective tool at mitigating point-of-sale fraud, it was, at least in its current sense, not necessarily a tool designed to mitigate card-not-present fraud. And so when we looked at these other markets, we saw this really significant growth in card-not-present fraud after EMV. Now, we do believe that card-not-present fraud, is going to continue to grow, after EMV has been implemented in the United States. But criminals don't move from point-of-sale fraud to card-not-present fraud overnight. If you're a point-of-sale fraudster and you've stolen from a big box store like Walmart for the past 20 years, you have a group of runners, you know what stores are prime targets, you know how to turn those products that you've stolen into cash, then ripping off Walmart.com tomorrow is just not a practical thing, right? But that being said, it's not as though card-not-present fraud in the United States is a small problem. In fact, it has been a larger problem than point-of-sale fraud for many years. Now, there was a bit of a inversion in 2014, and everyone knows what happened in 2014. You had Target, you had Neiman Marcus, Home Depot, and the online black markets were just flooded with card data, right? And that was just more than enough for criminals at the point of sale to go absolutely crazy. But now we're back where we once were, and we expect this difference between card-not-present fraud and point-of-sale fraud to diverge to an even greater extent as EMV exerts downward pressure on point-of-sale fraud, and criminals just get better and better at committing card-not-present fraud, right? So we have a big problem that we need to solve. That problem is certainly going to get a little bit more challenging. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to understand the effect of EMV on card-not-present fraud by looking to places like Europe. Now, is there something that we can learn from those markets and how they reacted and how they managed card-not-present fraud? Hogan, can you tell us a little bit about the 3D Secure experience in Europe and if there's anything we can take away from that?
Yeah, sure, Al. So what we have learned and what we have seen in Europe when EMV was introduced, and also when we saw 3D Secure coming on, we saw that some countries, they were better to embrace it, and some countries were a little bit worse to accept it. And overall, we can see that you're doing an online transaction, and if you are prompted with an extra step, with something that you're not used to, then you are more likely to abandon the transaction. And we saw that in most of the countries. So 3D Secure is a system that allows the issuer to actually authenticate an end user in the middle of an e-commerce transaction. An end user is not very happy to do that if he don't understand the context. So if he's just prompted to put in some random digits or some random password, he's likely to abandon a transaction or more likely than to proceed. If he understands what it's about, if he's asked the question, do you want to proceed with this online transaction, he's more likely to continue. So I think what we have learned in Europe is that a user needs to be aware of what is happening in an e-commerce transaction. And it's also the same for a merchant. A merchant is obviously very unhappy if he sees that the abandon rate increases when a new solution is introduced. So back to you, Al.
Thanks, Håkan. Now, one of the things, obviously, that consumers are not going to be aware of is what happens with their data. Now, if we go back to that chart that showed the card-not-present fraud incidents versus point-of-sale fraud incidents, and we had that dip in 2014, or that inversion, that was due to those major breaches. Breaches are the fuel for today's card fraud, whether that is point-of-sale card fraud or card-not-present fraud. And so recognizing that fact, we need to think about ways to protect that data. Now, if we can either keep criminals from the data or devalue that data, then that's going to really exert, again, significant downward pressure on card-not-present fraud and on fraudsters. Right? So how do we do that? So preventing access in the first place. Things like access controls, right? Making sure that the only people who get access to the data are in fact the legitimate parties. So that means, you know, strong authentication for the merchant or for the processor. But in the event that that authentication fails, you could layer on encryption, right? And, you know, it's a mathematical approach to rendering that data, you know, unusable to anyone except those parties with the keys, right? So taking that approach, we are really restricting the ability of someone to access the underlying data in the first place. But on top of that, we can also layer in tokenization and dynamic data, right? It just further limits the ability of the criminal to misuse data should they get a hold of it. You know, by tokenization, you know, what we mean is replacing the card value with a token, essentially, another value that has limited use. You can only use it typically in a limited number of transactions, and that's something that we see in Apple Pay, you know, for example, or dynamic data. And so when we talk about dynamic data, people think about the cryptogram in EMV, right? I mean, that's an example of dynamic data. It's data that changes from transaction to transaction. So by taking all of these approaches, layering them in, we could render card-not-present transaction data, you know, I wouldn't say completely immune, but secure it to an immense extent, right? So it's not just about, you know, not just about authentication. It's also about securing the data. Now, on the flip side, and kind of going along with this point, so I mentioned dynamic data, and you think dynamic data, you think the cryptogram and EMV. Now, that is an immensely powerful tool for preventing fraud at the point of sale, but it doesn't really do anything for you in a card-not-present transaction. So can we make data that's typical in a card-not-present transaction dynamic so that we get that same kind of benefit? And yes, we can. We could use dynamic CVV. So, and by that we mean CVV2, back of the card, you know, part of every e-commerce transaction, card-not-present transaction. And if that data was to change from transaction to transaction, if a criminal was to intercept that data, they wouldn't be able to reuse it, right? And there are really there are three distinct benefits besides just the variability of the data, right? It's merchant agnostic, meaning that to the merchant, there's no change, right? They're going to be collecting that CVV2 data no matter what. And so they don't see any difference in using a dynamic CVV. It minimizes the breach risk, as we mentioned, and then on top of that, it's device agnostic. Wherever the consumer is entering payment data, you know, this approach will work, right? So we are implementing an approach that's very similar to what we do with EMV, but for card not present. And if we can, you know, layer in that, you know, the strong security around the data, you know, as we were described, and we could get to a place where we see the same kind of fraud reduction benefits that we see with EMV at the point of sale. So a lot of promise in taking this approach. Another approach that we can take, and that it can supplement and or utilize a variety of authentication factors, is going out of band, right? So if they're making a purchase online, then sending or using the mobile device, for example, to either send a code, you know, take a biometric, but in doing this, we help to avoid any risks inherent to the channel in which they're interacting. So really interesting point to make around this is that we've started to see things like you know, banking Trojans, right, adapt to the online channel. So, you know, knowing this, by going out of band, we can avoid some of that risk, right? And going out of band is obviously a best practice FFIEC recommended approach to managing risk, and it's another way for us to help mitigate risk specific to any channel, right? And again, we have a lot of variety there when going out of band as far as factors are concerned. So a lot of things that we can do to both authenticate and protect the data. Now, that being said, this is where we are, right? But I think there are some other points that don't get a lot of attention, and I think this is very particular to e-commerce fraud, and especially when you're thinking about which solutions to implement. So we talked about what you can do to protect the data. We talked about some things you can do to better authenticate the cardholder or the customer. But when we look more closely at how e-commerce fraud has begun to change, it's become a much more challenging environment first for for the merchant or even for the issuer in understanding whether or not they're dealing with legitimate customers, right? These are the kinds of problems that the UK didn't have to deal with in 2006 or 2007. This is the e-commerce problems that we're dealing with today, right? Things like reshipping networks. E-commerce fraud in general has become big business. It's become very commercialized. Services are commoditized, and that means as a criminal, you can actually have your products not just sent to a ship location, but have them reshipped to you, right? And that just complicates the ability, or that just complicates the efforts of e-commerce merchants in identifying whether or not they're dealing with a fraudulent transaction. On top of that, you have bots, right? So it's not the criminal themselves placing an order. It is 100 machines that are part of a network of zombie bots, right, or zombie computers that are placing order after order after order, hoping to get products purchased through pure volume, right? And if you're a merchant, what that could end up looking like for you is a massive time investment in manual reviews. Now, how do you contend with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fraudulent orders coming in minute after minute after minute, right? Inevitably, some of these are going to make their way through the net, through your risk scores, and they're going to end up in the hands of a human being. And now you're talking not just about the potential fraud loss, but you're talking about the costs associated with having a human being sift through all of these transactions and attempting to verify them. And then you have digital goods. And I'm not just talking about Netflix, I'm talking about things like virtual gift cards, right? When there's no more shipping address to verify, and where you have to provide the product immediately. They're not going to wait a week to get their digital gift card, right? You have to give it to them then and there, and that really limits your ability to do things even like manual reviews in the first place. So managing for card-not-present fraud in the 21st century, in the year 2016 and beyond, it's going to take a different approach than we've taken before, because we're facing challenges that we haven't faced before. But besides these very particular challenges, there are, I think, there are consequences, let's put it that way, that tend to get glossed over, right? So we move into e-commerce, for example. We move to m-commerce, and merchants are not as prepared for managing m-commerce risk as they are for e-commerce risk. We can see that the amount of revenue they're losing to fraud, and that is significantly higher than is lost on average, right? Or that 1 in 4 fraudulent transactions are being successfully completed. That's because merchants are relying on tools that are designed for e-commerce fraud, not for m-commerce fraud. They don't consider that some of those tools don't work as well for mobile devices, and it just complicates matters, especially because early on we know that the early m-commerce merchants were big box merchants, right? And they could afford all these tools, and they were typically ahead of the curve anyway. But now, if you follow Black Friday, right, we know that m-commerce was huge on Black Friday. If you are a merchant online, whether you're large or small, you have to be in the m-commerce space. You have to accept transactions through the mobile channel. And for those smaller merchants, they're not used to managing this kind of risk. And in fact, I bet many of their acquirers aren't used to managing this kind of risk, and we're seeing that play out, right? So mobile is complicating things. The problem of fraud is not going away. Javelin's been measuring identity fraud for over a decade. That includes card fraud. 11 million victims last year of card fraud. What ends up happening is not just not only is there a loss to the institution in having to manage this risk, and you may think to yourself, well, you know what, the issuer is going to take the loss, or the merchant's going to take the loss, so why does the consumer care? Well, 1 in 3 of those consumers close their account. Many of them just stop using those cards in general, right? And what ends up happening is that they have to do things like, and we see this with breaches, right? If they have to have a card replaced in a breach, they then have to do things like update all their automatic payments. Okay, and they have to go through the time and trouble of contacting the institution and, you know, getting access to a new card. If it's a debit card, then they get worried about the fact that it's their money, it's not the bank's money as though it was a credit card. And it creates this negative experience, a knock-on effect when it comes to trust. And that pushes the card further down in the wallet. So when we think about card-not-present fraud, again, it has the potential not only to result in actual financial losses from the fraud itself, but from lost cardholders, or if consumers that just don't even walk into, well, say walk into the merchant, but are concerned about online transactions, you know, and the safety of those transactions. So you put up big walls, right? And, you know, we're going to stop fraud, we're going to put up these big walls, we're going to make it really hard for the criminals, but, you know, then you have the flip side of that, and that's the false positive. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of thing. We know that 2 in 3 cardholders who suffered a false positive decline, they either reduced the use of their card or they stopped using the card altogether. Right? So clear top of wallet impact, not to mention the amount of lost transactions, 117 billion, and then think about all the, you know, the interchange potentially that gets lost with that as well. It affects loyalty, and, you know, when you think about loyalty, you think about the lifetime value of the customer. So we throw out these numbers like $11 billion lost to fraud, or $117 billion in lost transactions from the false positives alone. But the lifetime value of these customers, I wouldn't say it's incalculable, because that's what we tend to do here at Javelin, is calculate these sorts of things. But the number easily dwarfs the other numbers, you know, that we've shared here today. So it's not just about the losses, right? It's about so much more than that. And so when you're thinking about what solutions do I implement, you definitely want to protect the experience, absolutely. You want to manage for the fraud risk, but, you know, when you're managing for the fraud risk, it's not just about the bottom line. It's about keeping that customer around. So when you're making that ROI calculation on a solution, you know, that is something you want to consider first and foremost. What is the lifetime value of my customer? So we're going to jump into another polling question here. All right. And the question is, what is your biggest challenge in online payment security? Is it user experience? Is it cost? Is it implementation? Is it transaction declines? Or is it all of the above? I feel like we kind of set this up here a little bit by throwing in the all of the above question. So maybe I can ask the attendees actually to do something for me. And just to prove that this is live, could you not pick the last box?
You've already done it.
No, it's if you haven't done it, or maybe if you can't change it. Well, if you cannot pick the last box, I want to see if we can get a slight shift in the responses here. All right, here we go. I mean, because all of these problems are definitely huge problems. All right. Okay. So let's go ahead and close it out. And what do we get? About a quarter say user experience, a quarter or so say implementation, another quarter, well, no, not even 14%. Okay. All of the above. I mean, that's, yes, I feel your pain, right? These are all huge considerations. And given what I've just shared, you know, obviously, they should all resonate, right? Because it's all tied together at the end of the day. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Håkan, who's going to walk us through what our options are and talk a little bit about the implications of implementing, you know, some of these solutions. Håkan, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. So let's take a step and jump directly to the next slide. Here is about how we can actually look at fraud from the perspective of the merchant at card present, and also then jumping much more into the card not present, which will be the major part of my presentation. But let us start at the left-hand upper corner. You will see an EMV ship. And that is obviously here, started to be fully implemented now. It's here to prevent fraud at the merchant, at the point of sales. If you then look at the right-hand upper corner, you see encryption. So that is very much needed in this case to protect the core from data breaches by encrypting data in motion. And if we take a look at this upper part, this fraud, the card present purchase frauds that happens at the point of sale, is around $4 billion yearly. And then if we then step down and take the lower part where you see card not present, that part is around $5 billion in fraud yearly. And that is what we are here to discuss. How can we actually beat that fraud? Because by implementing the EMV chip, we are actually fighting the $4 billion fraud in a very good way. So let's see what we can do about the CNP case. So let's take a look at the left-right corner where you have encryption. If I said encryption in the EMV case is data in motion, encryption at the CNP or card not present fraud is data at rest. So when you have stored all of your card data, this is where we encrypt it so no one can get access to it and reuse it without the consent of the end user, of course. So here we encrypt the data in rest. Take a look at the left hand lower corner. You see DCV. That was introduced by Al. That is the static CV made dynamic. So you will have something that is changing on a regular basis, and I will go into that in the next slide and show you actually how it is done. But before leaving this this slide, okay, we left it, but anyway, what I wanted to send you off with is that all of the solutions that you saw, the EMV and DCV, will then later on be protected by tokenization. So this is the first start. It's a very important start, what we can do right now to prevent fraud. If we then take a look at something that you all are very familiar with, it's a credit card. The difference with this type of credit card is that on the back side of the card, you will have your static CV usually. In this case, you will see something that says e-ink display change every 20 minutes. That means that the static CV is now made dynamic. The good part with this solution is, as we mentioned earlier, is that every change in the existing purchase behavior possesses some sort of risk if the user is not fully aware of what he's doing. So by having a dynamic CV, that means that any user having this card, he will use this as he's always been doing. He will fill in, when you do an e-commerce purchase, he will fill in his credit card number, the expiration date, and then he will fill in the CV. And in this case, it will be dynamic, but it will change only every 20 minutes. So when he flips it around, it takes his 3-digit number, he puts it in, and is done as he's always been doing in e-commerce purchases. And this is the big advantage. No change to the infrastructure, no change to the customer behavior. So if you have the credit card, with this, you are ready to go. Some might not want to have it on the credit card, but might want a mobile solution instead. So if we take a look how a mobile solution could look like, you will see that you will load all of your card data into an application, to a mobile app, and at the same way you will have a dynamic CV that is changing. So now we are once again doing an online purchase. We might use the PC, even though we have the mobile. We can use it on the mobile, but just say for the sake of it, we use the PC. What we will do at the time when we load our credit card details is that we will take our mobile, we will open the application, and then we will see the dynamic CV that we are going to use for this occasion. And it also says here that the display is changed every 20 minutes. As it is the mobile, we also have the opportunity to reduce that time if we would feel so. The very good advantage with this solution is obviously that the window for fraud is very low. So you have 20 minutes to steal all of the credit card data. If Håkan, if myself is online and someone steals the card data, it cannot be reused after 20 minutes, which is a great advantage, because most of the theft when it comes to card data is stolen on a server somewhere else, and it's not linked to this 20 minutes. It's days or months after. So this will stop a lot of ongoing card not present fraud. So let's take a look at now we've taken a look at the client side of it. Let's see what we can then do on the back-end side. So if we start first a little bit an overview of what we call a risk-weighted security solution. I will guide you through each step of this one, and then how it's also then can be combined with any client side, the card or in this case the mobile solution. So if we take a look at the left upper corner, you see user performs transactions in any channel. So this is an end user that is performing an online commerce transaction. So for the sake of it, we say that we're using a PC. Then we will see that the purchase is going through. You have loaded all of your credentials, the credit card and everything, and the purchase is off. Then it goes to bank, evaluate the risk. So in this, we will take a look at the certain transaction. We'll take a look also if it's coming from a PC or if it's coming from a mobile. We will take a look at the geolocation of it. Is it actually reasonable that you're doing this transaction right now, and so forth. Is it in US or is it outside? So this we are running a risk evaluation, and then you go further to where you see the third box upper. It will sell policy manager. In this part of the system, you will have a policy saying that, okay, if the transaction is of a high value, or if it's coming from abroad, maybe you are on a trip, then the bank will evaluate the risk as a little bit higher. In this case, you can trigger an out-of-band call. So an out-of-band call would be that I've started my e-commerce on the PC, but I will be prompted on my mobile phone saying that, do you really want to do this purchase? Please authenticate yourself, and I might just use my fingerprint to validate that transaction, and the transaction goes through. And this is in the risky cases. So if it would have not been a risk, it would have just been to put in your dynamic CV, your credit card details, and the transaction has gone through. In a certain number of cases, the step up will be like I just described. So if we then go into the next, I'll explain a little bit about out-of-band authentication. So what you want to do and to escape fraud is that you want to increase the complexity for the fraudster. And by increasing the complexity means that you can have something that's called out-of-band. So you split between the PC and using the mobile as the authentic mean for authentication. And we also mentioned that it's important that the end user feels that it's very convenient and very easy to do the sign off or the authentication of the transaction. So what we then do is that we offer flexibility. So in the previous slide I mentioned how an out-of-band case could be done and when the step up was needed. And in the step up, then we can ask the user to either use his fingerprint, he could use his face, he could also use a simple PIN to validate the transaction. But the important part here is to use something that is convenient for the end user, that he feels familiar with. And the risk-weighted security is obviously the step up. And I want to emphasize here, you only do step up, you only ask the user to be involved when you as a bank would see that it's a risky transaction. So let us then take a look at how it will look in practice. So you are using, or say, we take me as an example. We say that I'm on a web page and I'm actually having the chance to buy Michael Jordan's basketball, which would be a great price, 30 US dollar. But in this case, you as a bank, you know, I'm more of a hockey fan, and this would then be considered a little bit odd that I do this purchase. So in this case, you would then ask me to authenticate myself via a fingerprint, and that's the step 2. I will be prompted on my mobile, do you want to buy a Michael Jordan's basketball? And I will authenticate myself by just using my fingerprint, and the transaction goes through. So if you do it like this, you're actually involving the end user, and the end user is understanding why he's actually taking certain steps. So this is the next after the dynamic CV. If you have the dynamic CV, everything is on the rail. It moves as all users are used to. If you want to even further risk minimize and make it harder for the fraudster and involve the end user, an out-of-band message through the mobile is a very good way of doing that. Okay, Al, I'll give it back to you for the takeaways.
Thanks, Håkan. So what do we cover? You know, we started with identifying how EMV will impact card-not-present fraud, and basically where we are. And the fact of the matter is we are in a place where card-not-present fraud is an outsized risk, and it will continue to get considerably worse going forward. If we don't do 2 things, first, strongly authenticate the cardholder, and then second, protect the data, we're going to end up in an even worse place where we see significant fraud losses and customer attrition. And we're going to lose customers because they're experiencing fraud or they're experiencing false positive declines, and they're going to choose competitors or even alternative forms of payment, which is, you know, generally bad for everyone in the card space. Things we can do. We can leverage dynamic data. We can leverage out-of-band authentication, tokenization to protect the data, to protect the transaction, to get a better sense of, you know, who's on the other end of the line when they're making the purchase. This holistic approach is going to help us manage card-not-present fraud and really keep losses down, keep customers happy, and, you know, continue to grow those valuable relationships going forward. And we heard some great examples as to how we can do just that. So with that, I want to go ahead and open up the line for some questions. And Håkan, I'm going to start with. Actually, I have a few. So we'll start with the question about tokenization. I have a very particular thought on this, but I'll ask you to chime in here as well. A question around tokenization. How are tokenization transactions at risk? And I think it's a fair question, right? We've had tokenization in one form for a number of years, right? And that was the acquirer or merchant tokenization, right? And now we have a new form of tokenization known as network or issuer tokenization. The fact of the matter is we're using terms interchangeably. It's a little fuzzy, you know, as to how they're different, and we're just so worried about the risk of breaches. I don't think it's been clearly articulated as to if there are any risks around tokenization. So that being said, The one risk that really stands out to me is the risk of a token vault breach. And now there are none of these on record that I know of, but fact of the matter is, if we were to take all of this card data and we store it in one place, including the tables that match them up with tokens, that's going to be an attractive target. But if you consider that right now card data is stored everywhere, most of it is stored unencrypted or untokenized. I mean, it's written down on paper and it's being transmitted through insecure systems. At least in the case of the token vaults, they are going to be ostensibly with parties that have very strong security, right? And in the event of a breach, those things can be replaced very, very quickly, right? Because it's at the source. It's a very, very low risk scenario, as opposed to today where, I mean, the data is just at risk everywhere you turn. So there is no 100%, but I think far safer world if what we had to worry about were only token vault breaches. Hogan, any additional thoughts on that?
No, I agree fully on that one. As long as you protect your vault, you encrypt it, you should be pretty safe. I would see one other risk, and it's not really on the token itself, but it's how you actually handle the token. So if you are not securing the way of acquiring the token, so if you're using a token at your mobile, you might use it even for proximity purchases. You might use it for online purchases, but when you acquire the token, so if you have it in a token vault and you might load your mobile with 10 tokens, you need to make sure that you actually download these tokens to your mobile phone in a very safe way. So you also need to have strong authentication to acquire the token and sign them off, so that only you can download the tokens to your mobile phone, and then only you can use these tokens. So you need to secure the vault itself on the back end, but you also need to secure the way of downloading your token and have it secure on your mobile. So that's the comments I have on the tokenization risk.
Okay. It is the next question actually I think is more for you. Have banks in the U.S. done a pilot or done pilot testing on the DCV card, and are processors ready on the back end to support the technology?
Yeah, we have had a few pilots. We have customers in other parts of the world. In US, we have been very busy with the EMV migration during the last year, and this year is the year of dynamic CV, and also when we are also doing some pilots. And when we've done it, this has been both on the card and also on the mobile. But we are yet to see any commercial launches, and we hope to see them during this year. But yes, it's under pilot.
Okay. There's another question about dynamic CVV, and the question is: dynamic CVV, will it be a challenge in implementing and syncing with digital wallet platforms? Is this an area of focus or concern? Hogan, your thoughts?
Yes. So, are the question about okay? So hold the static CV. So is it that you will actually reuse the same CV for something that you have pre-signed up for, like a card on file, or do you understand this question better than me, Al?
Yeah, I think the question is about having a dynamic CVV card provisioned to a mobile wallet. Now, the card itself isn't provisioned to the wallet. Tokens are provisioned to the wallet. So I don't believe that having a dynamic CVV would pose any problems with that. And in fact, you're mapping the card in the token vault to the PAN and not to the CVV. So I don't think that this is a concern. Now, it's something that certainly, Hogan, you and I can take offline to verify. But I just wanted to make sure that my thinking was aligned with the question, or you were reading this the same way I was.
No, it's more that because it has, as we also work with the wallets, we have this integrated. I haven't seen this as a problem, because at least it's sold from us as a supplier. But I was trying to pitch in if there's something that I've overlooked, but I can't see that.
Okay. Well, it seems like it's answered. Another one, and this is a timely question. How realistic are selfies for card not present fraud? Saw a story on NBC News, national news last week about it. I'm going to start on this one. So, yeah, I think really interesting technology. I think you have a segment of the population that is going to take to this so naturally, and in fact, when everyone has, phones in their pocket with, front-facing cameras, it seems like a natural, right? Now that being said, I think that there are going to be certain segments of the population where this is not going to, they're not going to turn to the selfie first, right? So think seniors or just the tech adverse. So really interesting technology. I think it's practical in plenty of cases, and clear examples being Gen Y. But for certain segments of the population, you're going to need to have an alternative. Håkan, what do you think?
Yeah, for sure, and I think that's what we are seeing also, that banks segment their customer base in a little bit of behavior, and also what they are think is reasonable to use, and what they are used to have in their hands. So if you are a youngster, you might think that selfie is what you want to use, but as I said, some part of the population will not use it. So I'm sure we will see face. We know that fingerprint is extremely popular. I guess all of us are using it, and we like it. And I think it's the width of the solutions that you can put in hands of your end user, because if the user don't feel convenient or at ease to use it, they will not use it. So if you have a few things, they can use the face, the fingerprint. Some might even want to have a simple PIN. And if you offer that to your consumer, they will use it in the point of or in the e-commerce transaction flow. So you're prompted to do something, and you will select what you are more prefer to use. So I think that's actually, as you say, Al, some will use selfies, some will not, but we also need to find a solution for that, where fingerprint is obviously something that is widely used right now.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and this is it's a little bit of wishful thinking, right? But we are in a place where it feels like we're going to be able to solve for a lot of card fraud at the point of sale because of EMV, so not obviously out of the realm of possibility. But as an industry, if we are successful in, we won't call it eliminating, let's say reducing card not present fraud, where is fraud likely to mitigate next or likely to migrate next? So my opinion, based on the data that we have, would be account takeover and application fraud. And we've seen some of this already. We see this in other markets post EMV, is that some criminals, in order to get other cards, take over accounts or apply for new accounts. But just given the wealth of data that is available for purchase online, social security numbers, usernames and passwords, where consumers are reusing those, everywhere they go. And you have criminals who are going to be trained really to work in the digital space because of their card not present fraud experiences. I could certainly see that account takeovers in e-commerce and at banks, application fraud for a wider variety of accounts. Think about other types of loans like consumer loans, which is already starting to be a bit of a problem. I could see that being where they all kind of pile in based on skill set and available data. So there's always a new frontier for fraud, right? It's never going to be completely stamped out, but that seems to be, to me anyway, where it's going to end up. Håkan, what do you think?
Yeah, and I can actually give you an example of that, because from my native country, Sweden, we've been pretty successful in first securing the online bank. We started early, have quite friction in the online bank what you would be accepting in the US, but if we leave that aside, the online bank is pretty secure. When it came to e-commerce, we implemented as a country pretty quickly 3D Secure, but also made it more smooth to use. So it's actually an out-of-band, what I described, the out-of-band solution is used in card not present transaction. That has reduced the card not present fraud significantly. So I was just having a seminar with quite some of the banks from the Nordic regions last week, and I asked them about this, exactly what is happening now when you've been very successful in both in the online bank and in card not present to reduce the fraud. And as you said, Al, it's account takeovers. Actually, in the way that these fraudsters are now trying to fake IDs and then sign up with this fake ID to a bank, open a bank account, and then perform fraud out of that. So that is what at least we are seeing in the Nordics countries in Europe. So fraud is not going to go away. We just need to find ways to shut it down so as much as we can. And this is not a simple fraud. You need to be very advanced. You need to have a lot of money. So at least they have been able to mitigate many of these more simple attacks on the legacy systems. And now we see more targeted advanced attacks, but they are much less in numbers in actual fraud attempts.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's a good example of exactly what can happen. So there you go. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and close it out. Give people a few minutes back on their day. Had quite a few questions. We really appreciate that. If there are questions we have not gotten to, or if you have additional questions, please go ahead and let us know. Contact information is on the slide. You will get a copy of the recording for the presentation that should be made available tomorrow. Wanted to thank Håkan for joining me today. Great conversation. Want to thank Chimalto for making the presentation possible, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. It's been my pleasure. I hope you have a good rest of the week.
Short survey.
And there'll be a short survey afterwards, if you don't mind letting us know how we did, what you would like to see in the next presentation. Always forget about that. Thanks, folks.